Okay, so I'm going to get started non-stop. Okay, so the Bible is rich in stories about culture, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the Bible judges all cultures without exception against God's standards. So we will view some characters in the Bible from the perspective of cultural encounters and all their diversity. And so the goal is not just to gain insight about their diversity, glorious or inglorious, as they say, but because all the stories point to one greater story, which we know. They need salvation from Jesus, who will bring all these cultures into himself. So some define culture as beliefs or thinkings, values or feelings, customs, behavior. So it is impossible for an individual basically to be culturalist. And there's no such thing as a people group or ethnic entity without a common culture. And so culture acts like a roadmap. It guides members of society as they travel through life, basically to analyze and describe the world around them, how they think, right? And it guides them in what conduct is right and what is not right, how to behave. It directs them in what to like or dislike, what is beautiful and what is not, what brings pleasure or pain, how we feel, right? Or how to feel. So a typical cultural group, if asked why the members do something the way they do, the usual answer is because this is how we've always done it. So this group feels comfortable with this answer because it's based upon group tradition. And so traditions give stability and balance to a society. So the group may not feel the need to justify why they do what they do, right? So like in the movie Fiddler on the Roof, Reb Tevya, the poor milkman, asks, how do we keep our balance? He answers his own question with one word, tradition, right? He goes on, we have tradition for everything, how to sleep, how to eat, how to work, and how to wear clothes. For instance, we always keep our heads covered and we always wear a little prayer shawl. And so this shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? And he says, I tell you, I don't know, but because of our tradition, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do. So there are cultural traditions in Scripture, but when tradition turns into traditionalism, it takes precedence over the command of God, it becomes a stumbling block, right, to God's will and design for humankind. And so God worked in and through his servants, crossing through these cultures to bring the story of salvation in Jesus Christ. Now, human culture began with Adam and Eve, so the next logical question is, when did cultural diversity begin? Well, Genesis 11 informs us when and how this occurred. So the command to humans was to fill the earth. Instead, in direct disobedience, all humans congregated in one locale, right? United in one language, one location, one city, one name for themselves, one people, and one central reference point, the Tower of Babel, right? So the problem wasn't the tower, it was humankind's self-centeredness intent, right? We know this by the phrase, let us make, right, a name for ourselves. Then God says, and nothing that they propose to do will not be impossible for them. As a united people, they rivaled their need for a God, right? It was a civilization based on secular humanism. Instead of destroying, God separated and scattered them with the results of many languages and dialects. And so in Genesis 1, God created humankind and endowed it with culture. Then God instituted cultural diversity, Tower of Babel. Then God planned to bring blessings upon these ethnicities, right? So God began to repair the cultures, right? Through one man named Abraham, right? And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now notice this. To Abraham, God said, I will bless those who bless you. To Isaac, he said, I will multiply your offspring like the stars. To Jacob, he said, your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. And so the blessing was not just local or regional, it was going to be global. And so what is the theological insight? Well, Genesis 16 contains allusions to Genesis 3:6, a central parallel in Sarai's plan to produce the promised son for Abraham, or Abram. The writer's intent is to replicate Eve's attempt to find wisdom apart from God. So Eve desired fruit that she believed would make her wise. So she took the fruit, gave to her husband, and he ate. Likewise, Sarai desired a son, right? From whom she hopes her house would be built. So she takes Hagar and gives her to her husband, Abram, the fruit. In Sarai's words, my house will be built from him, right? Sarai's plan, like Eve, is to attempt to achieve God's blessing on her own without God's help. And so Sarai's plan, although seems successful, it does not have divine approval. And that's the thing here, right? There is no divine approval of this. Another parallel is after the fall in Genesis 3:9, the Lord asked Adam and Eve a question, "Where are you?" In chapter 16, the Lord finds Hagar and greets her with the question, where have you come from, and where are you going? And so there's a lot of parallels in the Bible. And they always go back, for some reason, back to Genesis. So tonight we're going to study Hagar, right? Sarah and Hagar. So the setting, verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar." So Sarah is the second woman mentioned in the Bible after Eve. She is Abraham's wife, and today she is often referenced as a pair. Every time they mention Abraham, they mention her. So a recurring theme in the Hebrew Bible is the problem of infertility, right? It also appears as a theme to a lesser extent in the New Testament. So throughout Sarai's story, she attributes both her infertility and her fertility, obviously, to God's will. When someone was married to royalty or a prince, succession was of great importance to them in that culture. So it was common that there be a hereditary or dynastic kind of succession of rule. So to have a male heir was obviously crucial. So Sarai knew that she needed an heir, especially after God made the promise, right? And Sarai was thinking that it was her fault that the promise could not be fulfilled. And so although we read in chapter 16 as Abram's story, he is actually marginalized, right? Because verse 1 anticipates the thought that Sarai cannot give Abram a son. So the logical question for the reader is whether Sarah can solve the problem. So Sarah seems to then disappear from the story, and she's not presented in the third person until verses 8 and 9. And so verse 2 says, "So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai said." So when he instructs Abram to procreate with Hagar, she explains, "You see, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children." So Sarah waited years to conceive, and so the shame of not having a child basically weighed heavily on her. Sarah devised a plan to become a mother by way of surrogate. Sarah has made a proposal, and Abram has a choice to make. Is he going to trust in Sarah's wisdom or in God's promise? So sadly, he chooses Sarai's limited human wisdom as we read. Abram agreed to what Sarai said, right? Sarah is not always subject to Abram's whims, right? In fact, this part of her story shows a true reversal of power. She tells Abram what to do. He's not the one in charge. So the father is traditionally the head of the household in these stories. He owns the property, including the enslaved people, and he brokers marriages on behalf of the family. In this part of Sarai's story, she takes on the role of controlling procreation. So Sarai's story helps us to view into the roles that women play in this patrilineal descent, which was so important in the ancient world. So in this case, it is far more important that Abram have a male descendant than to remain sexually faithful to his wife. So to our 21st century minds, I cannot imagine any wife thinking that it would be a good idea to provide her husband with another woman to sleep with. Normally, a man gets a wife, or his parents get one for him. But here, the wife gets another wife for her husband. So it's easy to look at the story today and basically condemn what Abraham and Sarah did. But what Sarah did is exactly what Rachel and Leah did, right? When they were given their handmaids to Jacob to produce children for them. And it was common practice in their culture in which they lived. Abram and Sarah were living by the codes and cultures and laws and morals of that particular day. So according to the culture that they were living in, their actions were appropriate. Right? The fact that God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, they were used to sacrificing children. That was nothing new. And so the child born of the union between Abram and Hagar will be the adopted son and heir. So, however, there's no mention of Abram or Sarai consulting or receiving directions from God himself to carry this out. God's promise to Abram and Sarai is basically messianic. The Messiah will come through their line. So God has no intention of changing his divine plan just because Sarai wants to change it. Although Sarai might have had the legal right to give Hagar to Abram, it was not right in the eyes of God. Hagar was sinned against, basically. And Sarai's scheming and Abram's willingness to go along with the plan, they both defile the marriage bed, which is designed by God to be between two people, as we know in Genesis. And so Hagar becomes the first victim of their sin. And Hagar did not have legal rights for the abuse of which she was a victim. And so there are no legal systems that would back her, no organizations on which she could lean for support, right? No church like today to whom she could reach out for help. And so she must have felt powerless and quite alone. Sarai and Abram's plan was not God's plan, and so tension arose between Sarai and Hagar. Now, I've read this, and it's very good. I recommend it. And so verse 3 says, so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Now, why does the writer mention the 10 years in Canaan? Well, the writer is informing the reader that it has been 10 years that Sarah has not been able to provide a son for Abram. And to claim that even before they moved from Haran to Canaan. See that? And so they have not been able to have children. So this provides the Jews with an argument to divorce a wife after 10 years if she has not been able to produce children. So it's important to understand how the family unit would have worked during the time of Hagar when she was a slave of the house of Sarai. And she would have lived and worked with the family and was likely not near her own family, right? So as a slave, she would not have many rights. Although the laws of Hammurabi, which were widely used during Abram's day, basically lay out guidelines for how to treat slaves. So as a young woman, Hagar would not have many other options. Women did not have careers or invest in their own trades outside the home. In order to survive, she had to live in someone's household, either as a wife, a concubine, or a slave. Hagar has been taken from her Egyptian home to Sarai's household in Canaan. Okay? She has already been uprooted from her former social identity and place and family and even her support system. So the question, was Hagar even an Egyptian? That's the question I asked, right? The writer just mentions her as an Egyptian slave, but that can mean Hagar was a slave in Egypt, right? But she was probably not an Egyptian, from my perspective. So the journey from Egypt to Sarai's household may have caused Hagar some physical and psychological distress, right? So today some women are willing to be surrogates for infertile couples, right? They negotiate the terms of conception, usually in vitro, and what kind of care or compensation they are going to receive. But that was not an option for Hagar. You didn't negotiate with your slaves, you ordered them, right? My husband needs to have a son, right? The Lord has withheld me from having children, so you're going to do it in my place. That's the negotiation, right? So in verse 4 it says, he slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And so when Sarai gave Hagar right, to Abram as a wife, basically she gained the status of a concubine, which came with a certain promotion of rights. But it did not make her equal to Sarai, the primary wife, right, or the chosen woman of the household. So Hagar's identity comes by way of her involuntary surrogacy. So when she discovers she's pregnant, Hagar assumes a new identity. Hagar is now in a position of power as mother to Abram's child. And so it's not surprising then that Hagar develops arrogance in her newfound identity, that she comes to despise Sarai, and like Sarai, Hagar transitions from victim to victimizer. Now Hagar reinforces Sarai's pain of infertility by basically lording it over her, right? And taking advantage of her new exalted position. Hagar dishonors Sarai. So given the social strata of the culture, Hagar's position as a mother made her feel higher than her mistress. We don't know how she demonstrated this. Perhaps her conduct was inappropriate or her attitude, right? Sarai considers Hagar as an object of utility rather than a woman. Sarai does not take into account that Abram and Hagar might develop feelings for each other, right? And Hagar could, turn that straight line between Sarai and Abram into a triangle, right? And so changing the dimensions, basically, of Abraham's heart, especially if Hagar is carrying Abraham's heirloom child. Ancient law stated that if a slave promoted to be a wife could not hold the new position with decorum, she was to return to her former state. There it is, right there. It's all in the Code of Hammurabi. Verse 5 says, Then Sarai said to Abram, You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Okay, if I'm Abram at this point, my first thought, oh, it's all my fault? Right? And whose idea was this in the first place? Right? How Sarai describes the wrong done to me in Hebrew basically reveals a lot about Sarai. So the Hebrew word for wrong here is hamas. We've all heard that word, right? It's occasionally translated as wrong in a general sense, right? But more often it means specifically violence, right? So Sarai equated the wrong Hagar was doing to her with mass murder. In other words, the Hebrew is ambiguous, as if Sarah is saying, I messed up, and it's your fault. In other words, she is saying, basically blaming it on Abram, a wrong has been done, and it's your fault because you're giving her reasons to think that she is the favored one. So Sarai is jealous, and that Abram is showing Hagar too much favor, basically encouraging this attitude of contempt. So Sarai is blaming Abram for not keeping a proper distance from Hagar, and reminding him that it was just a business transaction, not love connection, right? So what I have up here, this is the Greek Septuagint. The Greek is older than the Hebrew. I know everybody thinks that Hebrew is older, but it isn't. It's the Greek, right? This goes back to about 250 BC. The Hebrew Masoretic text is 1000 AD, our time. Now, the oldest Hebrew manuscripts are the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they weren't discovered until 1947, and therefore, back then they didn't know that they were even being written. Now, the Bible does mention that they have the law, the Torah, but we have no manuscript evidence. And even if we did have Hebrew manuscript evidence, it wouldn't be this type of Hebrew. It would be actually Paleo-Hebrew, totally different, which we do not have any evidence physically of it. Okay, so that's why I'll always have the Greek, because the Greek is older, and then we'll have the Hebrew. And sometimes you're going to see that there's a difference in how they translate. And so Sarai blaming Abram for not keeping the proper distance, obviously because of the transaction. And so it's as if she's saying, you are going far beyond the transaction. You have overdone it with your embrace, right? So one can almost feel the anger and how this is beginning to brew. So in effect, Sarai is saying, I am more righteous than you, Abram. The Lord judge between us. What is Abram to do, right? So this is understandable given the dynamics of relationships. Sarai was not blaming Abram for a marriage that she suggested, but is calling for her husband's attention to his responsibility to correct the unexpected situation than just sort of leaving it up to God to fix it up, right? So verse 6 says, Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So Abram did not say, hey, let me go talk to Hagar and, smooth things over. I mean, you know, Sarah, that you're my favorite one. He didn't say that. Abram just steps away and restores Sarah to her proper position, right, in their culture, which in fact she never really lost. It was just Sarai's, haunting suspicion that something was going on. Abram said, the slave girl is in your power. She's yours. Now she may think that she has maneuvered her way, right, into a closer position with me, but she hasn't, right? That would be inappropriate. But no, she's your slave and do with her as you please. And Sarah did. She did treat Hagar more like a slave than a servant. So the word mistreat or harshly in the Greek Septuagint in the top is kaku. It literally means to injure. In Hebrew, it is ana. It literally means to afflict. It can imply a severe form of corporal punishment, right? It incorporates the idea of whipping. Okay, so that should give you a better idea of what mistreat it is, right? And then verse 7 says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. Now I'm going to tell you something right here. Remember the spring. In all the night classes we're going to have, remember the spring. Remember that. Because we're going to make a connection in the last class, right? Now, this location of the narratives shifts from the household of Abram now to the desert. Okay, so this is the first appearance of an envoy from God. So this messenger is like a presidential aide, right? He was sent to investigate some questions or implement a presidential decision. So God does not usually send an envoy after a runaway slave, right? So perhaps it was Abram who sent this messenger. We don't know up to this point, right? We can think of it. It's interesting that the person that God approaches in this situation is Hagar. He doesn't come to Abram or to Sarai. He comes to the least likely of all the people that messed up, right? The one who seems most dispensable, right? And disappears into oblivion in the pages of history. And so Hagar flees from the oaks of Mamre, which is north, and she is going south into Egypt. So home was not a place of wonderful prospect. She was sold in slavery years earlier. So she's not going home necessarily to a happy ever after situation. The best years of her life are probably better with Abram and Sarai. Now the wilderness of Shur is between Canaan and Egypt. Hagar by this point would have been walking a week already and was close to the border of Egypt. So does she stop by the spring just to get a drink and rest? Or does she stay overnight? Or does she hitch a ride or see some kind of new master that will take her in? Or is she nearly home to Egypt? So verse 8 says, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Well, Hagar probably thought, who is this being that knows my name and knows I'm a slave of Sarai? So notice he addresses her in the status of humility and not as Hagar, the wife of Abram. The mentioning of Hagar's name by the messenger contributes to Hagar becoming a real person in the story, in contrast to Abraham and Sarah, who never mentioned Hagar's name. You can read the whole story, they never mentioned her name, right? So the question, where have you come from? Well, Hagar was coming from a place that really and probably, at least in her life, was as good as it gets, right? The second part of the question, where are you going? And so when we are moving, the trajectory of our movement is one of two things. We are going from a place that is not so good to a place that is better, or we are going from a place that is better to a place that is not so good. So for Hagar, even if you're pregnant, better all the dangers in the desert than humiliation in Sarai's house. Hagar has lost her home, Sarai her maid, and Abram his second wife and child up to this point. And then in verse 9, the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Now, notice the messenger did not say, return to your husband, Abram. Very interesting. So the instruction for the messenger to go back seems harsh, especially to travel back another week on the road when she was so close to home. So the writer does not inform the reader whether she does return to her mistress by this point. And when the baby is born, Sarai is nowhere to be found. The angel of the Lord has some unique quality, and when this individual shows up, the thing that distinguishes this angel is his authority. Unlike other angels who say, God said this, God said that, this angel speaks in the first person singular. I would do this, I would do that. Speaking with authority as some other species of being. At first glance, we might be troubled by this instruction. We might wonder why she is told to return to a toxic situation. Right? I suspect he sends her back for her own safety. A young, pregnant woman should not be wandering in the desert alone. So we can picture her coming nervously, questioning back into the encampment. Right? She may be afraid of getting another beating. And so she's probably wondering if she will even be allowed to have access to speak to Abram and tell him what happened in the desert. Who spoke to me? So she's probably bursting to tell the news, but wondering how she will be received, or if they will even believe her. Perhaps the reception was very cold, especially from Sarai. So the idea here of submitting to her is actually invoking an ancient Near Eastern custom. In other words, fall, prostrate on your face before her. So this isn't just a return back and casually apologize. Hey, look, Sarah, if I offended you, I apologize. No, this is return and prostrate yourself and beg her forgiveness. That's what the messenger is saying. Because even as a slave girl, you were better off there than you could ever be in the place where you're going, right? So eat a little bit of that bitter pill, so to speak, right? And tough it up and just wait. Wait on the Lord. And so these two women are in different circumstances, but equally valued, obviously, in the eyes of God. So two women who come to look down on each other. Chapter 16 is the first of a number of stories where women assert the responsibility of their own destiny. right? While one is young, poor, and fertile, the other old, wealthy, and infertile, right? So God addresses both by name, something unheard of in the ancient world. After all, these are women, and everybody knew that the gods only speak to males, not females, right? Or anything in between. Verse 10, the angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. So, the necessity for Hagar to return to her mistress is implicit. You must return. Why? Because her offspring needs to be born in that context. And so verse 11 says, the angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. Right? So, to accompany Hagar during this week walk, as she returns to her mistress, God basically showers her with promises, right? Kind of to help her. So the aide speaks as if he is God. He is passing along God's own, his own words. God is present, not in the messenger, but in the message. Ishmael is the first person to be named before being born. So verse 12 says, he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. Now, the word donkey is not really in the text. Okay? It's in our English text, but it's not in the Greek or Hebrew. So Ishmael is half Egyptian. Here's the cultural context, right? Intercultural also. Ishmael is half Egyptian, half Abrahamic. His mother is a slave and a second wife. What chances does he have? Intercultural ethnicities. A hybrid, so to speak. A Semite. Remember, Semite comes from the sons of Noah. Shem. That's where we get Semite. A Semite, Abram, from the line of Shem. And a Hamite, Hagar, from the line of Ham. And these two create neither fish or fowl. So the Ishmaelites become the desert, hardened, fighting people of the wilderness. Bedouins who live hard lives and never did organize themselves into a great civilization. But they are not some to mess with. And so they become both troublesome to the Canaanites and the Mesopotamians. And they live in the Arabian desert where life is extraordinarily difficult. And they were viewed as a very difficult people, just like the angel is describing here Ishmael. Neither Semite or Hamite, right? But another option out there that he could not identify with. He was neither one, right? I know, I was born in Monterrey, Mexico. My dad was from here, so I was naturalized here. And when I go to Mexico, they say, well, you're not really from here. You're from the other side. And when I'm from here, they say, well, you're not really from here. You're from the other side. See, I'm nobody. I'm in between. And so, in other words, the writer's point is when Hagar, as Sarai's slave, Hagar was not free to do, right? She was a slave. She was not free to do. Her son Ishmael will be free to do. So what Hagar could not do, the son will do, right? And that's the messenger's focal point. So Hagar's blessing in Hebrew draws a wordplay between wild donkey, Pere, right, and Paran, or the deserts of Paran, right? But again, the word donkey is not in there. And so the biblical location of the tribes of Ishmael is Paran. Okay, so verse 13 says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. So Hagar names the Lord who spoke to her, which is very unusual because it is usually the superior, right, who names the inferior. And so here Hagar is perhaps astonished, thinking, have I really seen the Lord and survived and remained alive? Remember, the Bible says nobody can see God and remain alive. So in chapter 16, the name for God is Lord. In chapter 21, the name for God is Elohim. In chapter 16, the name of the messenger is called the angel of the Lord. In chapter 21, he is called the angel of the Lord. Right? I'm sorry, the angel of the Lord in one and the angel of God in the other one. In chapter 16, the angel of the Lord meets Hagar at the well. Right? In chapter 21, the angel of God speaks to her from heaven. So Hagar is, in the scriptures, basically the first theologian. She is the only person in the First Testament who gives God a name. Hagar knows that theology is doxology, but it's paradoxical too, right? For the writer of Genesis to say that Hagar named God because Hagar does not know at this point that his name is Yahweh, right? We don't know God's name is Yahweh until you get to the Exodus. So we have different manuscripts in Hebrew. One will say, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Another manuscript says, in the beginning, Yahweh created the heavens and the earth. Well, you can't put Yahweh because we don't know his name yet till the Exodus. And so that's how we know there's different writers, right? And then we have another writer that comes and puts it all together. Like, I can't use this, so I'm going to take this out. I'm going to omit it because we don't know God's name yet. And then we're going to bring this other thing in, right? To complete the story. And so Hagar knows that seeing God's messenger is basically like seeing God himself without the danger of dying. He has seen her and she has seen him. Verse 14 goes on to say, that is why the well was called Be'er Lohai Rai. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. Notice that it says it is still there. Okay, so the well of the living one who sees me. So the audience reading or hearing this story, they're familiar with the well, right? We're going to make that connection with the well, right? It was a spring, not a well. Okay. Verse 15 says, so Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son that she named, right? To the son, that she bore. Verse 15. So Abram obviously names his son Ishmael because Hagar told him the name that the angel said, right? Again, we're not told in the story if Hagar returns specifically to Sarah, but if anything, she does return to Abram. Now, some would have liked that the story end with Hagar naming the child. So Abram naming Ishmael confirms that his acceptance of this child as told by Hagar concerning the angel was true, right? It is Sarai's right place as the mother to name her adopted child with her husband, but she's nowhere to be found, right? It's her place. But the writer omits details at the end of the story about Sarai. And so Sarai was the one who began the process of this whole child, right, to build up her house for Abram. But guess what? Now she realizes after all this, her hope would not be built up. On the contrary, it's Abram and Hagar that are being built up in the story, right? At this point in the story, verse 16, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Now, remember, the Jews love gematria, numbers, right? All the numbers have a meaning, right? So 14 years later, Isaac was born to a 99-year-old Sarah and a 100-year-old Abraham. So not long after, Sarah observed Ishmael, dishonoring the infant Isaac by mocking him. Everybody remembers that, right? So this offense displeased Sarah that she persuaded Abraham to expel Hagar and Ishmael permanently from their community. Sarah never quite tells Abram that Hagar is the primary problem. Instead, what she does is she recruits Isaac as the reason for throwing out Ishmael along with the mother, right? Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman should not be heir with my son. Strong words. So Sarah is aware that when she throws Hagar out of the house, Hagar has no social protection. In Sarah's religious zeal to shape their religious future, and in her love triangle torment, she forgets that God is the God of Hagar as well. So the Jewish Midrash, these are writings of the Jews, it's called the Midrash, tells us that after Sarah dies, Sarah's son brings Hagar, renamed Keturah, back home, back in Genesis 25:10. Isaac seems to understand that his father cannot be whole without Hagar's love. So in this way, Isaac guarantees that Abraham will find comfort in his final years. Okay, this is not in the Bible. This is Jewish writings or commentary. Okay? So they believe Keturah is Hagar. So after reading this, one could conclude that Sarah was a mean, jealous wife, out to harm the powerless subordinate. Twice, Sarah did not seem to care if Hagar and her child survived a scheme that she herself orchestrated. So as if they were just objects with no value by the end of the story. Sarah becomes an ungrateful, overprotective mother who got rid of her rival, guilty of mistreating an innocent, inferior attendant. For Hagar, running away likely offered her a temporary illusion of being in control. That's right. She's making the decision where she's going. She's in control. Even if she did not know where she was going, at least she could feel that she was the one deciding what direction to take. So it is not difficult to sympathize with Hagar's identity crisis. Hagar is the only woman in the Bible whom God personally promised a multitude of offspring, and the only person in the Bible to give God a name. Right? So, is it possible that Hagar and Sarah at one time had a good relationship to some point? You ever think about that? I mean, it makes sense, right? For some reason, Sarah trusted her enough. I mean, she had other concubines. She trusted her to a certain point, maybe even respected her. So the problem with Sarah and Hagar erupted when Sarah got caught in her own fears, when she temporarily lost faith in this new God that Abraham was following. And she felt the need to take matters into her own hands, right? Now, a scholar, Greg Kinnear, he points out that Sarai likely acquired Hagar during Sarai's own victimization, remember, when she was in Egypt. She was feeling powerless due to sexism, racism, and abuse. At times like Sarai, hurt people to be in control, right? Everybody remembers when Sarai got taken. Now, there's another Jewish commentary that says that Isaac is not Abraham's son, but I lost my train of thought. The Pharaoh's son. That's interesting. And you go back and think about it. Not biblical, but their commentary makes it very interesting. So Sarai would act like both the Pharaoh in Egypt and her husband by seeing Hagar as property and not as a valuable person, and giving her to Abram to be used sexually for Sarai and Abram's own purposes, right? So Hagar's story is interesting for so many reasons. She was not a child of Israel. That's one. She was an Egyptian slave, if she was, who became the victim of Abraham and Sarah's bad decisions. Yet even while she was powerless in her circumstances, she was not overlooked by God. Hagar was one of those independent souls who, over time, forced us to come to terms with an entire institution whose purpose was to dehumanize others. If you ask me, she should have been in the list of heroes of the faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Honor and shame in these cultures. We in the West, obviously, we miss the importance of honor and shame values in biblical cultures. Honor is the worth of or value of a person, both in their eyes and in the eyes of the village, neighborhood, society, the public. It's the nature of respect, reputation. I remember in the Karate Kid, if you saw Karate Kid Part 2, remember the bad guy comes at the end, and what does he say? I'll get respect, honor, if I do this, right? From them, from the crowd, right? So shame is basically it's very painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed, unworthy of love, unworthy of belonging. So it's the fear of disconnection in those cultures. So over a 25 period of Sarah's life, she experienced both honor and shame. As the wife of Abraham, she held a position of honor with the community. She was honorable that two kings wanted her, Pharaoh in Egypt and Abimelech in Canaan. Right? They attempted to take her as their wife. But over time, her inability to bear children brought shame to her. Right? Not only was Sarah frustrated, she was devastated. Her very personhood and that of her son were attacked by the actions of Hagar and Ishmael, according to her. And so, Sarah's conflict, right? The interaction between Sarah and Hagar was truly cross-cultural. The writer repeatedly tags Hagar as an Egyptian, as a slave. And the writer goes out of his way to remind the reader of this 3 times. If Sarah permitted Hagar to persist in her actions, then Sarah's own actions and personhood in the eyes of the community would be compromised in their culture. Right? We don't know about that stuff. So this is where the Hebrew language helps us to see the tension in the phrase, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So, with contempt in Hebrew is kala. It literally means to be made light of. The Greek reads, the lady was dishonored, atimaso. That literally means dishonorably with indignity, perceived as having no value. Right? So the wording makes all the difference. It helps us to understand it better. Sometimes our English translations try to smooth things out. They don't want the Bible too rough. Right? So this is why the ESV has an alternative reading. Her mistress was dishonorable in her eyes. Right? So in that society, this was the highest form of offense. Hagar was manipulative. Sarah was humiliated. And 14 years later, Hagar's son did a similar dishonor on Sarah's newborn son, Isaac. Again, the writer mentions in Genesis 21:9, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Now, the word laughing is intensifying the Hebrew word saka, meaning to mock or to kind of jest at. So here the Greek Septuagint has the word paiso, right? Kind of sounds like payaso in Spanish, like a clown, right? Playing in English. That's how the English translates it. So properly it means to play like a child, to play, to sport, to jest, right? To give way to hilarity, especially by joking, singing, or dancing. So there are many ways that probably Ishmael did this, mocking. So either way, shame is intended. It doesn't matter, right? Likewise, Ishmael wanted Isaac to be seen as flawed and unworthy, hoping to disconnect his relationship with his father so that Ishmael would be seen as the undisputed son of the blessing. So Isaac was too young to understand Ishmael's mocking or playing, but Sarah understood it, right? The implications of such shame on the one whom God promised. And you're laughing at him. You're mocking him. So what does Sarah do? Like any other mother, she acted to preserve Isaac's honor. Cross-cultural insight. Sarah's behavior toward Hagar throughout these chapters reveals principles related to guilt, innocent, and honor and shame system, so that we are to keep in mind when we are engaging in cross-cultural interaction today. In the West, we recognize that our cultural orientation is primarily guilt, innocence, right? We are concerned about justifying our actions in a guilt-innocent framework. Guilt is about what I have done. And so in most non-Western cultures, life is seen from a collective society that values group participation and affirmation. And so they are concerned about justifying their actions in an honor and shame society. Shame is about who I am, right? So this is one reason the Jews could not accept Jesus, because he was claiming to be a one-man Israel rather than a national Israel society. Also, in the Middle Eastern society, the individuals do not place blame on themselves. So if you were with me for the Vacation Bible School of the parables, I mentioned this in the parables. We see the scriptures with the lost sheep, the lost coin. The shepherd nor the woman in the story say, I lost the sheep or I lost the coin. Because they don't do that, right? They would say, the sheep got lost. The coin got lost. See, it's about honor and shame. That's why she has to throw a big old party. And so they will never admit fault, because why? It is shameful in their culture. So anything that Hagar was doing or Sarah was doing, they're not going to admit the fault, right? And so what is the cross-cultural takeaway from this? Well, most non-Western people today have the same honor and shame value system that we read about in biblical culture. So in presenting the gospel today, we need to be aware of the difference between their frame of reference and our Western guilt-innocent orientation to lead more sensitivity on our part, right? And an adjustment of our gospel presentation to them. So Sarah and Hagar, two cross cultures. She was from Ur, right? Abraham is not Abraham, Ur of the Chaldeans, because the word Chaldeans didn't exist in Abraham's time. He was actually Ur of the Samaritans. So he's already coming with one cultural background. Sarai is coming with that same background from Ur. And then an Egyptian now set in another culture in Canaan. Think about that. Ur of the we like to say Ur of the Chaldeans, but Ur of the Chaldeans, and then they go to Haran with another culture from the father, and then they move to Egypt, where they go to Egypt, right, because they had to, and that's another culture interaction. And then the Pharaoh releases them, and now she has a slave girl with her. Egyptian, she may be. We don't know where she came from. So she's bringing another culture with her, right? And so God has brought these two cultures in Scripture, Sarai and Hagar, and even Abram, right, to the marginal extent, bringing them together so we can see it's not just a woman and woman thing, which it was, right? But it was also a cultural thing. And that image of that movie Sarah, the one that I showed you all right now, well, it's actually called Abraham, from the Bible collection. The Bible collection series is very good because they try to make it as dramatic and real as possible, not Hollywood version type. But what I like about it, there's a scene where Hagar is preparing what do you call it, for the baby? The bed, I don't know what to call it. The crib, right? And Sarah sees her and Sarah is preparing it and Hagar sees her and says, what is that? And she's saying, well, I'm preparing it for the baby. And she said, that's not how we would prepare it. In other words, in Egypt, we would put spices and this and that. And then, obviously Sarah gets upset. But that's not how we do it in our culture, so to speak. So it's a very good movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but I highly recommend it. What time is it? 6:45. Okay. Here we go. So if you are a Sarai, God loves you. Wait on him. If you are a Hagar, God hears your sorrow. Call out to him. If you are Abram, be patient. Wait for God's guidance and provisions. Comments or questions? Awesome.
So Western culture is identified like guilt, innocence, and Arabic culture is honor, shame?
Most Middle Eastern.
Middle Eastern?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So more than just the Arab culture, all Middle Eastern,
Well,
or mostly just Arab?
In that study, what I had learned too, and this was a study I did years ago, because like in Iraq or Iran, like with Muslim women, some are more free than others.
Right.
And so some have already adopted the Western culture. And a lot of the men don't like that, but they have more freedom. They have more freedom in Iran than they do in Iraq. Iraq's a little bit more stricter with their women.
That's because of the Shia, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had a very interesting conversation with an Afghan man and his wife. She was not able to conceive. I think she has endometriosis. Difficult. She knew that he had shame because he had no children. And in their culture, it's a shame to not have children. So she said, I really think you need to take another wife so you can have children, and it's permitted to have 4 wives in our culture, and that way you won't have that shame. Now listen to his answer. I love you. I would never love another woman as much as I love you. It would not be appropriate for me to take another wife because I would use her to satisfy the cultural shame of not having a child.
Wow.
I was blown away.
So he's going against the culture of their culture.
She was willing to go along with the culture. He loved her enough that he was going against the culture to stay faithful to the woman he loved.
Wow. Every other man would have laughed at him. What's wrong with you?
That's right.
Yeah. In Greek culture, it's the opposite. It's okay to adopt. That's how a lot of these Caesars are. They were adopted. There's nothing wrong with that. Can't have kids, we'll adopt. Any other comments or questions?
That's what I would have suggested to him, adopt, but
Adopt,
I didn't make that. It wasn't me to make that suggestion.
Anything else? I'll just end with a word of prayer, then go to your prayer.